Order. Meeting is now resumed.
Good morning, Mr. Commissioner. For the record, it's Patrick McGowan. With me is Jennifer Chan. We're counsel for the Commission. Today we have a new panel before you. The panel will be dealing with topics related to Aboriginal fishing. Just to introduce you to the panel, Mr. Commissioner, from left to right. On my far left, we have Mr. Ross Wilson. Moving to the right, Mr. Ernie Cray, Mr. Marcel Shepherd, and Mr. Barry Rosenberger. Mr. Rosenberger has been a witness here previously. Perhaps before we get started, if we could have the witnesses sworn.
Do solemnly affirm that the evidence to be given by you to this hearing shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do. I do. I do.
Would you state your name, please?
Ross Wilson.
Thank you.
Ernie Cray.
Thank you.
Marcel Shepherd.
Thank you. Counsel?
Thank you. Starting with you, Mr. Shepherd, you're a professional mediator, facilitator, and negotiator.
That's correct.
You are the coordinator of the Upper Fraser Fisheries Conservation Alliance, sometimes called the UFFCA.
Was.
You were, formerly. And you're the former executive director of the Fraser River Aboriginal Fisheries Secretariat, sometimes called FRAFS.
That's correct.
You continue to assist FRAFS as a facilitator.
Yes.
You sit as a Canadian member on the Pacific Salmon Commission's Fraser River panel.
As an observer.
As an observer. Thank you. And as the Upper Fraser representative on the Integrated Harvest Planning Committee.
That's correct.
Thank you. And what First Nation band do you belong to?
I belong to the Wet'suwet'en First Nation.
Thank you. Mr. Wilson, you're a member of the Helpsick Nation?
Yes.
And you're currently the director of the Helpsick Integrated Resource Management Department?
Yes.
You've held a number of previous postings, some of which include Chief Counselor for the Helpsick Tribal Council
Yes.
and the Aquatic Manager for Helpsick Integrated Resource Management Department.
Yes.
You currently sit on a number of boards and committees, including the Co-Management Working Group for the First Nations Fisheries Council.
Correct.
Now, if we could just first of all have Mr. Shepherd's bio marked, which I neglected to do. That's at our tab 21.
Exhibit number 1244.
Thank you. And if the next exhibit could be Mr. Wilson's biography, which we now see on the screen.
1245.
Thank you. Mr. Cray, you're a member of the Stolo Nation.
That's correct.
You worked for the Department of Fisheries and Oceans as an Aboriginal advisor from 1984 to 1990.
I did.
Your current role is as Fisheries and Policy Advisor for the Stolo Tribal Council.
That's correct.
You're a member of the Fraser River Aboriginal Fisheries Secretariat Executive Committee.
I am.
You're also a member of the Fraser Valley Aboriginal Fisheries Society, sometimes called FAVAFS.
Yes.
And you're an alternate member on the Monitoring and Compliance Panel of the ISDF.
That's correct.
And you've also previously served as a member of the Pacific Salmon Commission's Fraser River panel.
That's correct.
Thank you. And if Mr. Cray's biography could be the next exhibit.
Exhibit number 1246.
We could please have exhibit 323. Mr. Rosenberg, you've been here before and been introduced, so I'll just briefly remind the Commissioner. You've been with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans since the late 70s.
That's correct.
You're presently the Area Director for the BC Interior.
That's correct.
Position you've held since 2002.
That's right.
And you're also, since 2009, the Canadian Chair of the Fraser River Panel.
That's correct.
As I said, Mr. Commissioner, Mr. Rosenberger's CV is Exhibit 323. It's been previously marked. Mr. Shepherd, I'd like to start with you, please, with a couple of questions about the Upper Fraser Fisheries Conservation Alliance. Now, the Commissioner is familiar with that organization. It's detailed in a document prepared by the Commission. But I wonder if you could just briefly describe for the Commissioner your understanding of this air body's purpose.
Thank you. Well, the way that I understand the Upper Fraser Fisheries Conservation Alliance is that it was formed out of necessity for the 23 member bands that formed the membership back in the sort of early 2000s there was a real need that was identified of supporting one another in conservation and management of the salmon on the Fraser. So out of that need, most of the bands from Williams Lake North had had not been receiving their food social ceremonial fisheries, and therefore found that by working together as a collaborative, that they would have a better chance in trying to get the numbers back to their natal streams in the upper watershed. So it was formed out of necessity, and it's been quite successful. It was also formed to look at some sort of mandated representation issues and to reduce funding competition in the upper watershed.
And how long has that organization been in existence?
I think its incorporation was in 05 or 06, something like along those lines. So we're looking at about 6 years now in operation.
And is it funded primarily through DFO's ARM program?
Primarily, but not exclusively.
And I wonder if you can just briefly articulate for the Commissioner some of the benefits that you've observed flowing from the organization of First Nations in a sub-regional body like this.
So the benefits, as I see them, have been better coordination of activities in the Upper Fraser. A strategic plan was developed 6 or 7 years ago before we were even incorporated. It's an extensive document. It's about 120 pages, which breaks the watershed into 5 sub-regions, which are based on watersheds. And so we were able to do that. We were able to pool our resources and our expertise. We have now, I think, on staff up to, at any given time, between 3 and 5 biologists, which we share. And the benefits have been incredible. We have community fisheries liaisons representing each of the communities, which report back at forums. We hold about 8 general meetings a year, and they roam around the watershed, and they bring issues together, and our agendas are always very highly focused and usually deal with specific issues, whether it be preparing for a fishery on any given year. So for 09, which this is all about, we would have got together sometime early in the spring to start talking about stocks of concern, on all of the technical issues, and looking for mutual areas of support and development of positions. So I think it's been very effective in that way.
Thank you. Could we please have Commission's document 29 on the screen? Talked about the program being financed primarily through the ARM program. Just want to ask you, on the screen right there, is this a copy of the ARM agreement that sets out the funding and other matters related to the Upper Fraser Fisheries Conservation Alliance?
This is an agreement, but I noticed that it also is an amendment.
Okay, thank you. If that could be the next exhibit. The UFFCA is required to file progress reports periodically.
Yes.
Could we please have tab 30 from our documents? And is this an example of one of the progress reports that has been prepared and filed?
Yes.
If that could be the next exhibit, please.
1,248.
Mr. Cray, I'm going to turn to you now and ask you a couple of questions about the Lower Fraser Fisheries Alliance. Is this a fairly new body?
It is. We've worked for the better part of a year putting the body together.
Okay. I wonder if you could just very briefly describe to the Commissioner what it is and how it might be similar or different from the UFFCA.
The Lower Fraser Fisheries Alliance has an assembly, a political assembly, that has mandated a committee, the executive committee of the Lower Fraser Fisheries Alliance. That's where the executive committee derives its mandate. All 29 First Nations on the Lower Fraser River are participants, and there's expressions of interest from other First Nations to join in. It's been around for about a year. We've spent a lot of time on internal organizational matters, putting the organization together, laying out a vision and goals for the organization. And also, we've spent a fair amount of that time this past year working closely with representatives of DFO.
Okay.
They do participate in the Lower Fraser Fisheries Alliance. They have people that sit at the table with us. And so it's it's a bit of a work in progress, but we're well on our way to having a body on the Lower Fraser River that coordinates meetings between and amongst the First Nations themselves, and in turn works with representatives, employees of the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. And of course, the focus and the interest is the Lower Fraser fishery,
Right.
and how it might be how it might be managed now and on into the future.
So this organization has both Tier 1 and Tier 2 aspects to it?
It does.
And it's funded primarily through the ARAM program?
That's correct.
Mr. Wilson, do the Helpsick belong to an ARAM organization?
The Island Marine Aquatic Working Group?
Okay. And do you also have some connection to IMOG?
Yes.
Okay. And IMOG stands for?
Island and Marine Aquatic Working Group.
Thank you. I've got so many acronyms here, sometimes I forget what they stand for. The first ARAM body that you mentioned is somewhat different than the previous two we spoke about, is that right?
No, actually, it's the same. Sorry.
Is it? Okay. And is the IMOG organization distinct, or does it carry out a very much a similar function as well?
Same function.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Rosenberger, you attend meetings with, at least in the Upper Fraser, with the UFFCA?
That's correct.
And you also attend meetings with a number of other First Nations fishery-related organizations?
That's correct.
In an average year, approximately how many meetings would you have with First Nations fisheries organizations or First Nations about fishing?
Personally, probably 20 to 30.
And is it similar numbers for you, Mr. Cray or Mr. Shepherd?
The question is how many meetings I go to with DFO in the room?
Yeah, in a year.
Yeah, I would concur, something along those lines.
A similar experience for you, Mr. Cray?
That few? It feels like more. But yeah, I'd say 30 to 40 meetings annually with DFO in the room.
Okay, Mr. Wilson, do you have a similar experience, or are you?
Oh, no, much less.
Okay. Mr. Rosenberger, with respect to these organizations we've been speaking about, like the Upper Fraser Fisheries Conservation Alliance or the Lower Fraser Fisheries Alliance, is the department's intention that they can at least in part satisfy their consultation obligations by engaging with these ARAM bodies as opposed to with the individual bands?
That's correct.
Okay. And I take it that's because in DFO's view it's easier to consult in aggregates.
Well, it might be easier to consult in aggregates, but the objective is to try to get an integrated plan, so it's better to bring all parties to the table. So that's the overriding objective.
And to the extent the department is moving towards a co-management relationship with First Nations, is it their desire to accomplish that similarly by engaging with aggregates?
That's correct.
Okay. Mr. Shepherd, speaking of the Upper Fraser Fisheries Conservation Alliance, does that organization view itself as being a consultative body that speaks on behalf of its member organizations when engaging with DFO?
So is it mandated? Is that the question?
Yes.
Is it mandated to speak on behalf of its representatives
Yes.
at that table? No.
Okay. What about the Lower Fraser Fisheries Alliance, Mr. Cray?
Well, the Lower Fraser Fisheries Alliance has a mandate, and it has a set of terms of reference. I wouldn't go so far as to suggest that it speaks for the First Nations collectively on the Lower Fraser River, but it does work between and amongst the First Nations, cooperating, planning, discussing issues of importance in the fishery or for the communities in the fishery. Looks at helpful projects of a scientific nature or a study nature that might be helpful. Reports back to the Assembly, the Lower Fraser Fisheries Alliance Assembly, which are the communities. But in the Fraser Valley, the consultations have to include the communities themselves. And the LFFA is not a one-stop shopping spot for DFO. But it plays a key and it's an important role
Okay.
on the Lower Fraser.
And Mr. Wilson, does that similarly describe the mandate of IMOG with respect to the health stick?
No, currently IMOG is relatively new, so they haven't created that structure yet,
Okay.
but that's the plan.
Okay. Mr. Rosenberger, I take it the department's aware of the position of these organizations that they don't speak, they're not mandated to speak on behalf of their member bands. Is that fair?
That's correct.
With respect to any of these ARUM groups or any of the other ARUM groups that exist, is sub-regional bodies, is the flow of money to any of these organizations contingent upon them being able to agree to engage with DFO on behalf of their member organizations?
No, it is not.
Is there a hope that ultimately someday sub-regional ARUM bodies like the UFFCA will develop into representational bodies which could speak on behalf of their member bands from
That's
DFO's
correct.
perspective?
That's right.
And I'll ask the rest of the panel, is it the hope of those organizations or the First Nations that belong to them that ultimately they will hand over authority and mandate these organizations to deal with DFO on behalf of their member bands?
Yes. I would say that's part of the a longer term goal of the First Nations on the Lower Fraser River.
I agree.
And what would have to happen, what's going to have to occur in your view to move these organizations to the stage where they are mandated to speak on behalf of their member bands? I'll perhaps open that up to why don't we start with you, Mr. Shepherd?
Well, there's a number of things that have to happen. I think some of this was touched on in the past, but certainly, the ability of the First Nations within the Upper Fraser to have that, to be able to mandate somebody to negotiate on their behalf is going to be a very tricky maneuver, but that's what's going to have to happen if the ARON body is going to be more of a meaningful consultative body. Then the First Nations internal governance structures would have to be more solidified, and more clarity would have to be sought around what is actually going to be negotiated away at those tables. So that would be the number one starting point. But also from the other side is the commitment from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans to the long-term viability of these bodies, and a meaningful relationship based on improved decision making within the regions, and I would say stable funding flows, less bureaucracy. There'd be a number of things that would have to be in place in order for these things to be more effective.
Okay. Mr. Gray, do you have anything to add?
I would agree with Mr. Shepherd. The arrangements we currently have with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans are year by year, and some of the discussions what we're looking for that would give impetus to the kind of thing that Mr. Shepherd has just described is ultimately getting a clear signal from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans that they're prepared to help sustain these bodies for the longer term, that it's not, Mr. Commissioner, just a year-by-year arrangement for funding and for talk, but that they're in it for the long term, and a very clear signal of the direction in which they would like to go. And of course, first and foremost in our minds these days is the notion, the concept of co-management. So we're waiting from a clear signal that from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans or the Government of Canada that's where they ultimately want to go.
Thank you. Mr. Wilson, do you have anything to add to that?
A few points. Long-term funding, capacity development authority, structure of IMOG has to be created to provide our attendance, consultation with First Nations communities, and commitment from DFO.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Rosenberger, presently significant aspects of pre-season and in-season management are accomplished through the Fraser River Panel and through IHPCs. How do you see these sub-regional organizations feeding into those processes moving forward?
You mentioned the panel, and then you mentioned a different process.
Yes.
Maybe you could clarify the question, please.
Presently, there's First Nations representation. Let's start with the Fraser panel on the Fraser panel. Is that correct? And those members are appointed by DFO?
That's correct.
Do you see DFO handing over the appointment duties, the selection duties to First Nations organizations in the future?
What we're striving for on appointments to any of the panel processes is First Nations to provide lists of 2 or 3 potential candidates. The selection of the individual to sit on there is at the discretion of the Regional Director General in the department.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Mr. Shepherd, I wanted to ask you about the geographic, and Mr. Cray and Mr. Wilson, about the geographic organization of the ARAM bodies. Mr. Shepherd, first of all, is it your expectation, given the hope that these bodies ultimately can become mandated to deal with DFO on behalf of their member bands, that they will be involved in co-managing the resource on behalf of the First Nations with DFO?
Yes.
Okay. Presently, is the UFFCA organized, or the sub-regional ARAM bodies like the LFF, or the Lower Fraser Fisheries Alliance and the UFFCA, are they organized geographically along the same nation lines as the ITO?
No.
Okay, are they organized according to the same geographic regions that are used by the FNFC?
No.
If those bodies are also going to be involved moving forward in a co-management relationship, are these geographic differences going to cause difficulties?
I suppose they could. You know, the things are not happening all succinctly. Things are happening in a timeline.
Yes.
So ARAM came along. ARAM was an opportunity. So there was an organization and a move to organize in order to meet this sort of the parameters that were laid out essentially within those agreements. So, you know, after 7 years or 6 years of working together, we have a very effective working relationship. What happens now with the new mandated organizations such as First Nations Fisheries Council or any of the other ITO, for example, remains to be seen. I think that there's strong support for those organizations in the Upper Fraser, and the relationship, how it plays out over the next years, is going to be critical in terms of stability and as a consequence, providing the kind of sustainability that we're looking for in this commission.
Thank you. Mr. Cray, maybe I'll just give you an opportunity then to weigh in on the relationship between these bodies and broader watershed-type bodies or province-wide bodies like the ITO and the FNFC and the different geographic organizations that they have.
Sorry. One of the reasons we put the Lower Fraser Fisheries Authority together and got a mandate from the Lower Fraser Fisheries Assembly, these would be the chiefs and councils in Assembly, was first of all to organize the communities on the Lower Fraser River. And there's acknowledgement that ultimately we'll have to look at coordinating our efforts with other First Nations in the watershed, and also our efforts with First Nations in what are called the approach waters to the Fraser River. So while we're not at that stage yet where there's a representative group throughout the watershed, there's acknowledgement between and amongst the groups that we're eventually going to be working towards coordinating our efforts throughout the watershed and in the approach areas.
Thank you. Mr. Wilson, did you have anything to add to that?
We can see value in Fish Council representing the Central Coast. There has to be some work involved first, but with the IMOG, it would be a challenge because currently the IMOG represents First Nations outside of the Fraser River, and that's a lot of bands, both on the island, on the mainland, up the north in Haida Gwaii. So it would be a challenge.
Mr. Rosenberger, we've heard about some of these First Nations fishery organizations today and some of the processes that are in existence that result in meetings and DFO working together with First Nations. We've heard about the FNFC and FRAFs, and the Commissioner has heard about the form and roadmap process that work through that. He's heard about the ITO and now some of these sub-regional bodies, the UFFCA, the LFFA, and IMOG. Do you find that with engagement, the department engaging with so many different organizations, that there's to some degree a duplication of effort that occurs?
There is in some parts of it, that's right.
Okay, do you have any suggestions as to how any inefficiencies that exist might be better managed?
Well, the objective that the department is striving for is that there be an overarching body for either geographic areas or for certain species management, and that there would be sub-regional groups underneath that would report up, and then there are the bilateral or more local interactions that are occur, and so it's a package of all of this that needs to go on to be to form the consultations to meet the obligations, but that a structure like that would feed on information and objectives at the various levels, so that the uppermost body would be able to assist and work cooperatively, co-management, wherever we end up with that, in a process that would be the place where there would be opportunities for co-management in a more integrated way, and as opposed to a number of separate and sometimes proposals that conflict to a significant degree. So that's the structure that we're striving for, and we're hoping that through the roadmap and some of the other processes we will get to there. And the forum, as you mentioned, is part of how we're trying to make those decisions at the stage we're at right now. So we understand that the fish come back on an annual basis and you need to make decisions, and we don't have all of the structures in play. That may or may not be the structure that would be there in the long term.
Okay, and you spoke of an overarching organization. Moving forward, is the department working towards that being the FNFC or the ITO, or happening through the roadmap process, or is that not something the department is going to determine?
Well, we don't have a determination, and I don't believe that it's the department alone that can make that kind of determination. As you've heard from the other three members of the panel here, is that the First Nations need to work through a number of these different aspects. So what we're striving for in the roadmap process is to bring this broader group of people together to get to a process that we will all agree to.
And maybe Mr. Shepherd, I'll ask you the same question. In terms of an overarching organization to which these more regionally based ones may feed, is that, in your view, going to be through the ITO, the FNFC, or something else developed through the roadmap, or some other process or body?
Well, given the amount of resources and time that have been given to processes like roadmap, which I'm familiar with, I think that most people would agree that at some point that there would be an organization like that in place so that we could have efficiency in decision making. Yet we're away from that at this particular time. There's been a lot of work put into it. The roadmap has been in existence since 08. Is it 08? Yeah, since 08. So there's a lot of time and energy. And I think people are coming to the table. So that tells you that there's a strong signal for some kind of an organization to take on that role. Now, what it looks like and how much longer that would take, I don't know at this particular time.
Thank you. Do either of the other panelists have anything to add?
It's currently difficult for me to be attending these meetings because of my location, and I don't have the budget to do that. So to form a structure that would provide our input and carry on that workload for us would extremely benefit my nation.
I think the First Nations understand and acknowledge that eventually there's going to have to be, as Mr. Rosenberger described it, as a overarching arrangement where there can be discussions mediated through that body with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. But I think what we're looking for right now is a signal, an incentive, a commitment on the Department of Fisheries and Oceans that would give the kind of impetus that's needed to get there, and have particular signposts along the way, or particular targets along the way that we can sort of measure our progress to getting there. But that remains to be seen.
All right. I take it you're all, Mr. Wilson, Mr. Cray, Mr. Shepherd, all supportive of increased involvement of First Nations in management of the Fraser sockeye fishery. And Mr. Cray, you spoke about needing a signal from the department, perhaps a sign or a commitment. Is that sort of what you're looking for, some sort of a commitment and articulating what's on the table to be had?
I am, because in the programs that I've managed on the Lower Fraser, the work that I've done on the Lower Fraser, we've gotten a few times to a critically important place in our working relationship with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, in what one might describe as a proposal, a proposition from the bands on the Lower Fraser to pursue co-management. And before those arrangements could be concluded, often the department would withdraw from the process.
Right.
And I can talk later about one example in particular. So this time out, what I'm looking for, and I think what our communities are looking for, is a clear commitment that the department is in pursuit of co-management, that they're going to support it, that there's going to be resourcing for it, and that it's something of substance, and that it doesn't evaporate from or slip through our fingers at the last moment.
Mr. Shepherd and Mr. Wilson, do you agree with that?
Further, also, when talking about incentives, there are a number of things that would bring First Nations to the table. Of course, improved and increased decision-making at the regional level would be one of the signals that we would be looking for in terms of that. And as Ernie's already pointed out, it's the commitment also to a streamlined process that's multi-year in its scope, so that we know that it isn't going to be going anywhere. So I agree generally with what Mr. Cray has already said.
Mr. Wilson?
I agree.
Thank you. Could we please have Exhibit 493, that document? And Mr. Shepherd, I think it's a document you'll be familiar with. It's our place at the table. And you were one of the authors of this document?
Correct.
Thank you. And if we could just highlight the bottom right quarter under the heading Recommendation 3. You spoke in your evidence about DFO needing to provide incentives. And one of the incentives that's proposed here under Recommendation 3, First Nations themselves must address internal allocations. And then if we just head down to the second paragraph there, incentives are required to ensure such cooperation occurs. One incentive that would ensure all First Nations come together to work out allocations would be that everyone agrees or no one fishes. Do you still support that as one possible incentive?
I think that's a possible incentive, yes.
Mr. Cray, do you have any comment on that as a potential incentive to encourage First Nations to work together in sorting out allocations?
That would be an incentive. Undoubtedly.
Mr. Wilson?
Yes.
What work has been done amongst First Nations themselves, perhaps without even the assistance of DFO in the last few years, to address this recommendation to your observation, Mr. Shepherd?
What work has been done? Pardon me. To address this particular one. So in other words, what you're asking is that...
Recommendation 3, First Nations themselves must address intertribal allocations.
Right. So DFO came to First Nations in 2008 expressly through a letter asking First Nations that in the foreseeable future we're going to be into sort of low runs on the Fraser. Therefore, we would request a meeting to come together, which has now been called the forum process. The forum process was there to talk about sort of how First Nations see, in times of low abundance, sharing what small surpluses there may be to meet their FSC needs. Well, that's one of the things that's been underway. Now, that process is still going. It's now in its third or going into its fourth year. And, we're still talking about times of low abundance. So the discussion has been, we've been able to come up on an agreement to how to deal with early steward, for example. There's been, to some degree, a small amount of, what's the word I'm looking for, that they agree collectively to deal with early summer. But there's no agreement on a majority of the early summer runs and also the summer and lates. So to get to your question, there's never been an incentive. Nobody's been told by the department yet, look, if you don't come to this table, you can't really have any fish. Okay. So, but, there's talk, and there is something afoot.
In terms of moving forward with First Nations, I'm hearing from you that you want the department to step up and engage more and offer more to First Nations. Is it not difficult for them to do so if they don't, if First Nations haven't sorted out which organization they ought to be dealing with and what the structure of that organization is and how it's going to work, amongst the First Nations themselves?
So is it difficult for DFO to figure out who to deal with, and does that cause, some more,
Is that part of what's stalling this movement towards co-management or joint management?
I would say a part of it is that. Certainly not all of it, but certainly a part of it is that, yeah.
Is it one of the challenges that is faced on both sides of the issue, representative authority, those attending the meetings, whether they be the roadmap or the UFFCA, not having the authority to speak on behalf of those they're there for, from the First Nations perspective, on behalf of their member bands, and perhaps from the DFO, not having sufficient authority to engage in meaningful discussions?
Yes.
Mr. Cray, do you have anything to add to that?
I would think it's much more of the latter. There's a lot of uncertainty in the First Nations representatives about what the mandate is of the DFO employees that are sitting across from us at any given time. There's a lot of uncertainty about what their mandate is and what kind of negotiations they can have with the First Nations and where those negotiations might lead to. So we're looking for more clarity from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. And I think if we get to the stage where there's a definite mandate that is given to folks like Barry Rosenberger and others, and Barry Huber, folks that come and talk to us and invite us into these processes, which we most certainly want to be part and parcel of course, because we're talking ultimately about co-management, and that means work with the Government of Canada. But often we're looking for clarity on the part of the government. And once we see that they have clear mandates and they're committed to realizing certain goals and objectives with us, I think that that would be the impetus that the First Nations would need to sort out internally who will be representing whom and where and when and for what purposes.
Thank you. Mr. Wilson?
Just thinking about your recommendation 3 on the
Yes, certainly.
computer here, and the example I could use is the request from last year's, a band up on the Upper Fraser requested no fishing the early stewards.
Yes.
There was no problem from our community, which is in the Central Coast of BC, which has not first access, but early access to the passing stock. And we stayed away from fishing the early stewards.
So you're offering that as an example of First Nations working together to sort out allocation issues?
Yes.
Thank you for that. Mr. Rosenberg, do you have anything to add to the issue that we were just dealing with down the panel, and that is the representational authority issue and the mandate issue?
I think this is one of the clear issues that needs to be resolved for both parties to be able to move forward.
Thank you. And is the department similarly committed to moving towards involving First Nations to a greater degree in management of the resource?
Yes.
And maybe I'll start with you, Mr. Rosenberger, and then I'll give the rest of the panel an opportunity to weigh in on this question. And it's this: I wonder if you can offer to the Commissioner your views on how the greater involvement of First Nations in management of the Fraser River sockeye will improve management of the resource or benefit the sustainability of Fraser sockeye.
With mandated representation and clear allocations and clear responsibilities from all parties involved, I believe that there would be opportunities and ability to be able to make trade-offs and decisions where currently there's a number of conflicting objectives and goals amongst the First Nations and sometimes between the First Nations and the department. So if we get to those levels, decisions around some of the issues about who can access and where they can access. And the example that Mr. Wilson just provided, we have some First Nations groups that supported and endorsed the harvesting by Helsick of Fraser River fish last year in territories that are not their claimed area, and others from within the Fraser River that didn't agree with that kind of a scenario. And moving forward on trying to make decisions and how you would bring those forward, if we have, as I mentioned, a mandated process, then I think it'd be clearer on how to move forward on some of those kinds of issues.
Thank you. And maybe we'll move down the line. the importance of, or the significance of the involvement of First Nations in managing the resource to the sustainability of Fraser Sockeye?
Thank you. It's an excellent question, and I think that from my perspective, I've been involved in the management for 15 years plus. I've worked on the ground. I talked to my son last night, and we were bringing up pictures of the days when I was out breaking beaver dams, trying to get fish through, whether they were Chinook or sockeye or whatever. I mean, and then slowly working my way up into the management, and then eventually into policy and so on. I have a really good relationship, and I understand, and I think one of the things that's very critical from my perspective is the technical relationship between the two organizations, whether they be UFFCA, DFO, Lower Fraser, HealthSIC. The relationship needs to be nurtured in the regions, a technical relationship based on trust. And from that trusting relationship based in the regions, I think the common purpose is what Barry was getting to, is the development of a common purpose. From that common purpose, everything should flow. And so in other words, setting escapement targets in common, and dealing with conservation units in common, with a common purpose. I think from that perspective, sustainability is a slam dunk. We do have a lot of conflicting areas. So it starts with a program of science that is both agreed to by both parties, and then from there, I think everything else, including the policies to support those agreements, would automatically lead to the sustainability of the resource.
You talk about the relationship needing to be nurtured and the development of a common purpose. Can you offer sort of an example in concrete terms of how that's going to lead to more fish or better sustainability of the fish?
So I work a lot with my colleagues on the Skeena, and although the Skeena is not perfect, I think that the Skeena offers us some insights into how certain aspects of the fishery. For example, they've had problems with Chinook and with coho in the past. I know that the regional managers on the Skeena sit down with the Skeena Watershed Authority, which is comprised of all the First Nations working there. They sit down and they develop a program of science. They agree on what the priorities are, and obviously the priorities have something to do with weak stock management. And then, so from that particular point of view, then resources are sought collectively between the First Nations and the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, and then the program of work is set out accordingly. So it's always based on the weakest stocks where the money and the resources would go to. There's no quibbling, there's no competitiveness about resources. It's worked collaboratively, and I think that model is one that I myself have always looked up to, and I think that the Fraser has a lot to learn from there. And as I said, it's not perfect. There's still stuff going on the Skeena, but they tend to have more cohesion, more buy-in. The science between Dr. Gottesfeld and the scientists within the department, in some cases, exemplary, and I think is showing real leadership. And they've been able to sustain, for example, Nanakit and other stocks, which I've seen, where here they tend to go off the radar. Where if there was a good relationship, we have lots of weak stocks in the Upper Fraser that need attention, that we need to sit down and have an agreement upon, agree on a program of work, and I think that the sustainability will take care of itself.
Thank you for that example. Mr. Cray, I wonder if you'd like to weigh in on the significance of First Nations involvement to the sustainability.
Well, there were two examples that come to mind. One was, I believe, Marcel, in 1996, when the First Nations up and down the entire length of the watershed agreed on the importance of conserving the early Stewart, and came up with a conservation and harvest plan. And after we did our work as First Nations at our own table, we finally met with DFO, and together with DFO we settled on a plan for that particular season. So that was early on, that was in the latter 90s. And more recently, although, Mr. Commissioner, it's a step away from sockeye, the Lower Fraser First Nations were approached by the First Nations of the Nicola Valley. And what they're on about is conserving early Chinook. And they came and met with us and urged us to adopt a fishing plan, rather, a conservation plan for those fish. And central to it, of course, was not fishing. And after some lengthy discussions, after reviewing the information we had about these stocks, scientific information, we eventually agreed with them. And this spring, while we might have been out in other seasons, past seasons, far earlier fishing for Chinook. This year we didn't. We worked closely with those folks. We also went with those folks to the Department of Fisheries and Oceans and felt that Fisheries and Oceans could contribute to this conservation effort by curtailing the recreational fishery off the southern end of Vancouver Island and make that part of the overall contribution to a conservation effort for these particular stocks of early time Chinook. To DFO's credit, it did make some minor adjustments. Of course, we were insisting they do more, so maybe that's for a future season. So those are two important examples that come to mind, and of course we want to see that approach extended more broadly to other stocks of fish, most especially sockeye, throughout the Fraser.
Thank you. You mentioned the 1996 agreement. That was an agreement between First Nations about sharing and allocation.
Yes, that's correct.
And have First Nations been able, since 1996, in any of the years of low abundance, to come to a similar agreement where they were all
Yes.
in agreement?
We did that again where early Stewart sockeye are concerned. Right now, as we speak, as it were, we're reflecting on the importance of conserving early the early Stewart run this very season. And so the Lower Fraser has met and discussed how we might approach this. So we're right now engaged with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans on a conservation plan for early Stewart, one that would allow us to fish, for example, for Chinook and avoid taking the early Stewart sockeye. So we're in the midst of those discussions right now.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Rosenberger, since, I'll just come right back to you, Mr. Shepherd. Since 1996, and let's talk about 2007 to 2009 when there were runs of low abundance, was the department presented on behalf of First Nations with a sharing agreement that could simply be adopted, or did the DFO have to impose an allocation strategy in those years?
We have not received a document for sharing on other stocks and in other years. The department has provided options for how to make those sharing arrangements within each of those last 3 or 4 years, and which obviously wasn't needed in 2010. And the format that the department would follow and the rules and principles that they would use have been provided to the First Nations.
Thank you. Mr. Shepherd, you wanted to add something?
I just want to, I think because the early Stewart is such it's got a lot of profile, I just wanted to also highlight in 2007 or 8, the Upper Fraser Fisheries Conservation Alliance commissioned a study, a limnology study, to find out what the heck was going on with early Stewart sockeye. And so we had Dr. Levy do a report for us, and through the course of that, a number of recommendations were generated out of that report. One of the recommendations, in order to rebuild the early Stewart sockeye, one of the things that we were pushing for was to do a fertilization of Stewart Lake. Now, when that report was brought out, the First Nations in the Upper Fraser had a traditional ceremony. It was brought out with a lot of media and so on. It was obviously a priority. We want to rebuild this run. The recommendation coming from the report was we need to fertilize the lake. In order to fertilize the lake, you need about $1 million, and you need to do it fairly quickly because we were on the cusp of a high return, or the highest in a long time. However, the report went to the Department of Fisheries and Oceans along with a letter, and what we got back was not a priority. It wasn't really, plus the report wasn't conclusive enough, and so on and so forth. So what I was trying to highlight here is, I think, again, in a situation where we would have sat down and we would have had, a good agreement, a good working relationship, perhaps we could have worked on this problem, because the problem is still there. It's the stocks are not rebounding, even though we're offering them a lot of protection. So the recommendation was fertilize the lake, give the juveniles a fighting chance because they get a lot more groceries, so that they can leave and they're fat and fit. However, that is still sitting out in the ether. It has never been followed up upon, and I know it's still cause for tension for First Nations, going, why is this not happening? So, and I think, again, in putting it into sustainability terms, there was a great opportunity that I think we lost, and I think we need to think about that in the future.
Thank you. Mr. Wilson, I want to make sure you have an opportunity to weigh in on the important question of the connection between First Nations involvement in the management of the resource and sustainability.
I concur with Mr. Shepherd and Mr. Cray, but I would add that because of our location, there's a unique opportunity that we could provide some on-the-ground information, in-season management issues, DNA, stock size, location. It's something that the Upper Fraser or the whole Fraser River system could take advantage of.
Are you suggesting that the Heiltsuk are better placed or better able to carry out this work and in some way by doing so would provide greater benefit to the Fraser Sockeye than if the work was carried out somewhere else or by somebody else?
Well, on the ocean side, both the management and sustainability issues, but the Haida as well.
Turn now and ask a couple of questions about AFS agreements. Mr. Rosenberger, is the negotiation of AFS agreements each year a time-consuming matter for you and your staff?
Yes.
And does it similarly put significant time and resource burdens on First Nations, Mr. Cray? The negotiation of AFS agreements on an annual basis. Does it, Mr. Rosenberger was saying it takes a significant amount of time for he and his staff. Is it similarly a burden for First Nations to engage in the negotiation of these on an annual basis, AFS agreements?
Sorry, I was just a little confused about the choice of terminology.
Okay.
Right
If I got the
now,
terminology wrong, please help me.
okay. What we do spend a lot of time with DFO talking about before the season gets underway is a comprehensive fisheries agreement.
Yes.
And if you're using those terms interchangeably, the answer would be yes. It's demanding of our time, but AFS properly is a program. It offers funding, and a number of our communities in the valley get AFS funding, Aboriginal Fisheries Strategy funding.
Yes.
It was the inaugural program back in the early 90s, but now a lot of attention is actually focused on AROM related funding initiatives programs.
Okay, thank you. If we could just have document 28 brought up on the screen. You were correcting my terminology, so maybe it's an appropriate time to come to this agreement, which is the Comprehensive Fisheries Agreement, is it not, for a number of bands, including yours?
Well, not my community, but generally with a goodly number of the Stalo communities, the bands between Portman Bridge and Sawmill Creek in the Fraser Canyon.
If that could be the next exhibit, please.
Mr. McGowan, before we go ahead and mark that, we've just discovered that we, in our rush to get everything done on Thursday, we missed a number this morning.
Yes.
So the number we started with this morning, we started with 1244, which was the last number on Thursday. So 1244 now becomes 1245. 1245 becomes 1246. 1247 I'm sorry, 1246 becomes 1247. 1247 becomes 1248. 1248 becomes 1249. The exhibit you were now calling for will be 1250. Sorry for that error.
Thank you, Mr. Giles. And Mr. Commissioner, I'm just going to suggest that Mr. Giles update the exhibit list, and that will be updated for the use of all council.
Yes, that's already been done.
Thank you. I see, looking at this, that the duration of the Comprehensive Fisheries Agreement is for a single year. Mr. Cray, I'll start with you. Do you support the negotiation of Comprehensive Fisheries Agreements or AFS agreements that have a longer time period of effectiveness?
I do, and I've often been asked to, on behalf of the Stalo communities, to advocate for longer term, sometimes referred to as multi-year agreements between DFO and the bands on the Lower Fraser, the Stalo communities.
And wonder if you could just tell the Commissioner why you think that would be beneficial.
Because the communities in this kind of arrangement that are year to year they don't have the security of knowledge that there will be an agreement in the very next year. In other words, the department is committing to an arrangement that would cover, in this example here, that fiscal year and that fiscal year only. There's no commitment on the department's part to go the next year and the year thereafter and so forth. So it creates a lot, it lends itself to a lot of uncertainty. The bands are not able to come together and engage in long-term planning, and a plan that would include a significant and meaningful consultative role with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, because there's only a commitment to work for that particular fiscal year, and that fiscal year only.
Thank you. Mr. Rosenberger, has the department considered the prospect of entering into multi-year agreements?
We have, and we do have some multi-year agreements at present.
Okay. And moving forward, is the department's plan to increase the use of multi-year agreements, or has that been determined?
It is, yes.
Mr. Rosenberger, is it fair to say that a number of the allocations of Fraser sockeye that are negotiated either through AFS agreements or set out in comprehensive fisheries agreements have remained relatively constant for a number of years?
That's true.
When these allocations were initially set, I wonder if you can explain the process that the department went through to determine an appropriate allocation.
In the initial period, most of the work and some of the actual negotiations and leadership came from individuals from Ottawa. The information that we took into account were the harvests in recent periods at the time. So this is information from the late 80s into the early 90s, and the period of trying to establish the allocations were in that starting around that 1992 period with most groups. The groups that were using geographic areas, so there's at the time we had come off of a period when the harvests in a number of given areas were from individuals who may or may not have been members of the community that subsequently is the holder of the communal license for a given area. So trying to understand some of those dynamics of who fished in what areas, where they would, whether they would be allowed to stay fishing there, needed to move to other areas. Looking at the stocks, in the case of the Fraser, looking for stocks of concern and management issues. And then issues like population trends, some of the goals and objectives that were being raised in the first few years through the Land Claim Treaty process defined most of the background type of information that was used.
Okay. Was the department attempting to arrive at a number that reflected a genuine food, social, ceremonial need of the particular group that was allocated the number?
That's the objective, yes.
Okay. What information was available to the department about, at that time, about food needs or social and ceremonial needs?
Well, the harvest that a group might have had, so when I mentioned here earlier about some of the stocks of concern, and has been raised by the other gentleman here on the panel, we'd been in a period of a number of years of restrictions or closures around early stewards. So you have people who had a desire to fish on a given stock, you had some closure or restricted periods, so how did that weigh into their ability to be able to access their desired harvests and locations? So, were people, how did those scenarios play out against an area where, somebody may have had quite unrestricted fishing with strong populations coming back to them and presumably significant opportunity in order to be able to meet their needs. So those types of things were weighed in trying to understand what the allocation should be. Many First Nations provided their goals or objectives from their desires from allocations, and that information was looked at in a number of different ways.
Can we have Exhibit 303 up, please? Mr. Wilson, I'm going to ask you about this document. It was previously entered, and I think it's probably something you're familiar with. I wonder if we can just scroll down to the next page. Do you recall the HELTSIC doing some work to, and maybe we can actually go right to the end of the document, the last page. Do you recall the HELTSIC doing some work to attempt to identify and articulate the specific food needs for various resources in their area?
Yes.
Okay. And is this the document that set out the product of that work?
I'm not sure. I wasn't around when the document was created.
Okay. Mr. Rosenberger, do you get documents like this from any of the First Nations in your area?
Some First Nations groups over the years have provided some form of documentation to their requests. Others have just provided a fixed number without documentation to their desires.
Does the department on its own do any work to determine what a reasonable need is for food, social, and ceremonial use for any particular band?
We've looked
Or
at
group of bands?
various options. There have been a number of papers prepared by various individuals for various reasons. The department has not done a lot of work themselves on trying to define this type of work for a specific area. And the rationale for that is that groups have other species that they can harvest of fish that we have a concern about. They have other species, whether it be moose or deer or some other food source. So how they want to balance that out and what their needs are, it's that some people call it the breadbasket approach. But so taking a look at that, the department hasn't done necessarily a lot of work. We have looked to see about some of the numbers that are available for groups, so what they've harvested versus their population. Do they appear to be in a similar ratio, or some of them quite different, and then why they might be different? I would think there might be more work done that way in a land claim treaty process, but on the trying to do the annual allocations, not that type of activity.
In the Lower Fraser, there's an allocation given of approximately $300,000 for a large number of bands. Is that correct?
Well, the allocation, that's certain, it's $300,000. That number is available in the Integrated Fisheries Management Plan each year. And as Mr. Craig pointed out earlier, I believe there's 29 bands in the Lower Fraser.
Once the allocation's made to so many bands, does DFO get involved in sorting out which band gets to harvest which piece of that allocation, or is that left to the First Nations?
For the most part, our objective is to leave that to the First Nations. That's one of what we believe to be the responsibilities and accountabilities of the First Nation, to determine amongst themselves how that it should be fished and how it could be or should be shared amongst their people.
Mr. Cray, does the provision of a large allocation pose problems for First Nations, or have they in the Lower Fraser been able to sort out a method for determining who gets to harvest which piece of the larger allocation?
Sorry. Yeah, sorry, that wasn't. There are a number of agreements on the Lower Fraser. There's not a single agreement. The Harrison Watershed Authority, which is principally Scowlitz and the Chehalis First Nations, they make separate arrangements for a quantum of fish with the department. This is something that's occurred relatively recently. And it's been the case in the past that there's a broad allocation for the Lower Fraser River, but again into subgroupings. One, the Musqueam, Tawasin, and a category called Others, which I take it to mean, for example, the Burrard First Nation and so forth, who may gain access to Fraser River sockeye. And then, of course, there's the what's commonly referred to as the Stalo allocation, generally, which would be from the Port Mann Bridge to Sawmill Creek in the Fraser Canyon. It's not so much that the bands discuss and agree between and amongst themselves which communities will catch how many fish, so much as that it's a regulated fishery that includes a weekly harvest plan if there are fisheries conducted on a weekly basis. The fisheries, of course, are not an open-ended affair. You can start fishing now and just continue to fish. They are licensed, they're communal licenses, and they specify where the fisheries might take place, the type of gear that's employed, And the department, along with the planning committees that are assembled under the agreement, know how much fish might be removed in a given opening at different reaches in the watershed. So it's not so much that we agree to specific allocations for each First Nation. That's how things operate on the Lower Fraser, at least from Port Manbridge to Yale.
Thank you. Mr. Shepherd, did you have anything to add from the perspective of the Upper First Nation bands?
Only that we've not gone through any exercise to distinguish what the protein requirements or the food numbers are at this particular time. No.
Thank you. Mr. Commissioner, I know at the time, I wonder if this might be an appropriate time for the morning break.
Yes, the hearing's now, we'll recess for 15 minutes?
Just before
recess,
the Commissioner has a...
Just before recess.
Yes.
Just so I don't lose the thought, perhaps Mr. Cray could start. In the description you've just given, Mr. Cray, of what I believe you mean is the current arrangement you've described, how might that, at least in your thought, how might that be different under a co-management scheme?
Well, thank you for that question, Mr. Commissioner. When it comes to the notion of co-management and allocations, I take a far broader approach to the whole issue. Quickly, without going on at any great length, I think that what we need to do is reflect on the report, Our Place at the Table. We need to take some of those recommendations seriously. I think we need to look at broader allocations of the sockeye as between non-Aboriginal and Aboriginal interests. And once that's accomplished, then it falls to the First Nations to work between and amongst themselves with the department on allocating the larger Aboriginal share of the annual runs of sockeye. That's how I see it in the broadest possible terms. If we're able to move there, I have every confidence the First Nations can work it out between and amongst themselves. How many fish will be caught, where, and by whom, and for what purposes. But it would be the Aboriginal allocation. And that would help solve a lot of some of the more perplexing and some of the irritants in the fishery right now, where people concern themselves with whether or not fish are being sold or not. I think the place we need to move to is a broad Aboriginal allocation where the fish are then allocated by the First Nations between and amongst themselves. And we then arrive at a place where we have an Aboriginal fishery that has a larger allocation and then sub-regional allocations, which the First Nations would enjoy the harvest in. Thank you.
I would invite any other panel member who might have a view on that.
Thanks, Mr. Commissioner. I think the part that Ernie provided in the idea that we have clear allocations for all, and his description of the First Nations versus the non-First Nations, I think is an important step. And the objective, and clearly it's one of the issues right now, of how the First Nations share amongst themselves. So as Mr. Cray described it, there's an opening, so to speak. There's a planned fishery, area, geographic area, and gear, and things like that. And there are a number of First Nations currently who come into that process with a communal license that may not be the same for the, their allocations. They're striving to, or the objective the department has, is that they would strive and be the ones making those sharing arrangements, and if not be the role of the department. And I think that's how some of the management is occurring today. But moving forward, those clear shares between First Nations and non-First Nations is an important step.
I would only add that right now, from my perspective, coming from the Upper Fraser, that the management regime, or even allocation regimes, are kind of turned on their head. I believe that a good functioning system has to start at the headwater and work its way down. That way you have the ability, because the inextricable relationship between the First Nation and the fish itself, that the management and the allocation hence has to start at the top. In other words, meeting the needs of the people. If you're talking about overall allocations of fish for food, social, ceremonial, and for economic purposes, it stands to reason, to me, in my way of thinking, that it must start from the top, because the people that are closest and linked to those watersheds know what it needs to survive, because it's done that since millennia. But also, they're on the ground, so they would know how much food that they might need out of a particular run, and working in conjunction with DFO to get the science down straight, then you would be able to more accurately reflect, and I would say by virtue, the sustainability would just fall from that. I don't know if that makes sense. If you need clarification, I'm prepared to do that, but that's kind of my thinking around this issue.
Mr. Wilson?
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. I see value in what Mr. Shepherd is saying, and only add that the bans along the route outside of the Fraser River could play a big part, a huge part in the process. And because they're there, they're available, and I think that the information that we can give to the bands in the Fraser River would be invaluable.
Thank you. We'll take a break. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner.
The hearing will recess for 15 minutes.